Hi everybody, my name is Andy Shepherd. Very nice to talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Azure DevOps, which is a product that we've been using quite a bit recently at Azure, and generally speaking, people are starting to use more and more for managing their infrastructure and general development type products within Azure. So I thought I'd kick off generally just by going through DevOps as a concept in general, just a bit of an explanation around where the approach has come from, what type of things you'd expect to be doing when you're using a DevOps methodology to deploy your infrastructure, and then start to focus a little bit more on Azure DevOps specifically. And whilst we're going through some of those features, we'll talk about some of the considerations that you might want to take when you're starting out to use Azure DevOps to make sure that when you use it more and more going forward, you're using it in an appropriate way and getting the best out of the product. So to kick off with then, just generally about DevOps itself, so not specifically Azure DevOps, just the DevOps approach to managing your infrastructure and using that type of services that Azure DevOps can provide. What is DevOps? So Microsoft give a definition that you can see there. DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means, but there's the diagram at the bottom there sort of explains it best, but some of the bullet points that we can go through there. So as the name suggests, it's a combination of development and operations. So what you've got is operations and developments team, people working within the same team, and that could be a virtual team, it could be on Microsoft Teams, or it could be people who are actually sat next to each other in an office working towards a similar goal, towards the same project goals, that type of thing. And the idea is these people are working much closer together as part of the same team, and therefore they're able to respond to feedback from features that aren't particularly working correctly with a product or infrastructure that requires some tweaking, that type of thing. They're able to respond much quicker and able to develop and release code into the production environment much faster as a result of that. And sort of going along with the DevOps methodology, it's mainly about the people and making sure that they are you have representatives from both those development and operations teams, and they are working closely together. And in order to enable them to do that effectively, then they need to have the right processes and the right technology and the right sort of tool set and things like that to be able to enable them to do that. And that's what Azure DevOps is all about, really, providing all of that infrastructure type services from a technology perspective to enable people to do these things faster, and the ability for these people to collaborate within the same sort of space safely and securely and in an agile way to be able to respond to issues and code fixes and that type of thing much faster than they would in a traditional method. So you can see in the diagram at the bottom there, it kicks off with a plan phase. Any sort of project approach where you would start with the planning phase, so you need to decide what it is that you're going to do. With DevOps generally, you tend to pick like a 2-week period, which is known as a sprint, and you accept work into that sprint that you know you can complete within that 2 weeks to the best of your ability anyway. And within that 2 weeks, you would plan out exactly what you're going to do. You would then build and test that, and then you would release that into the wild. And then after that 2 weeks, you would receive feedback from people who are actually using that. It says customers there, but that doesn't necessarily have to be customers. That could be other people within your organization who are using the product or service that you've released. And it's about having that feedback loop there so that you immediately, as soon as you've released into the wild, you're monitoring for feedback and you're planning the next phase of deployment. And the idea is it's smaller, manageable chunks that you can develop and release into the wild relatively quickly and keep that continuous feedback loop going. And people see change happening much faster if they're able to see these releases into the wild, into production environments within a couple of weeks of them raising a request, for example. So applying that to Azure DevOps in general, so you can see on the right-hand side there, there's a number of different features and tool sets that are available with Azure DevOps out of the box. So the diagram shows Azure boards, Azure repos, Azure pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. Going to focus predominantly on the first 3 of those, so boards, repos, and pipelines. Those are the bits that most people are able to consume from day one to good effect. And most people would use those even if they don't use the other 2 at all. So we're going to focus on those 3 and we'll touch a little bit on the other 2 as well, just so you have an idea of exactly what those are about. But looking at the list to the left of those feature sets from Azure, there are a number of things that you want to think about probably before you start to deploy Azure DevOps and start to use it, to make sure that you're set up in a nice way going forward. So any new projects that you start to build within Azure DevOps are going to adhere to your sort of defined standard. So just taking that list, we'll just back through these one by one, and then I'm going to jump into the portal and actually show you most of this, just so you get an idea. I figure that's a better way of seeing exactly what it's all about. So the first sort of three, really, looking at these points as one. So a DevOps organization, if you think of that in Azure terms, that's basically the DevOps tenant that you would then create projects within. So it's sort of the root of everything, and you can assign permissions at that root level and create sub-projects within that. And again, you can assign permissions at the project level as well. But yeah, the organization level is designed to be the root level where anybody that's using Azure DevOps could have access to at that level, and then they would have a selection of projects under that they'd be working on. And obviously, from that perspective, it's important to design an organizational policy as well. So you don't necessarily want, for example, everybody creating organizations by default. You can actually do that. If you're a member of a DevOps organization, you can create new ones within the same tenant. Which is not ideal, because you may end up with sprawl, lots of different organizations spread across the DevOps infrastructure, everyone with their own different naming standards, that type of thing. Whereas if you restrict that down to an Azure AD group, for example, then you know you've got a select number of people or a team specifically that's going to manage that and create those organizations to a defined standard. I briefly mentioned naming standards, that they kind of apply to projects as well. So you want to make sure that any projects you create at a glance, you can kind of see exactly what they are. So defining that naming standard from the get-go is absolutely worth spending some time doing. And people break them down into for a variety of different reasons. So it might be if you're building an Azure landing zone, for example, then you might have an Azure landing zone project. If you then want to build an AVD environment, then you'd have an AVD project alongside that. You may have a development team that are specifically working on a website, for example, and they're developing the code for that in Azure DevOps, then you might give them a whole separate project for that as well. Yeah, having the naming standards there to enable all those different things at a glance to be able to understand what they are is a really good idea. And I mentioned that you can apply permissions at the organization level. You can do it at the project level as well. So you can sort of make sure that the right people have got access to the right areas within Azure DevOps. It's important to establish an organization owner as well. It's a bit like the tenant root level permissions of the organization owner. So it's really important to use something like a service account or something like that, just to make sure that it's a bit of a break glass account should anything else go wrong. You can still assign additional permissions at the organization level for people to be able to manage it. But yeah, having that break glass account there is a good idea as well. We're going to touch a little bit on billing as well. You do get certain aspects of Azure DevOps for free, which is great. And we'll have a look at some of the limitations around that as well. And obviously the auditing is built into Azure DevOps. It's all there by default, and you may just want to define some of the sort of nuances as to how long that information is stored for within Azure DevOps. If you want to capture that sort of information for a bit longer for compliance reasons or whatever it may be, then you can have a look at the auditing policies within there. And it's also important to establish someone who is going to be responsible for project lifecycle management. So you can imagine if you've got a number of different teams all working in Azure DevOps and they each have their own projects. Some of them might be POC type projects, which are sort of throwaway. You would want someone to actually clean up that once they've actually finished using those projects within Azure DevOps. You get a grace period once they've been removed. But it's important to understand who is going to be responsible for managing those projects on an ongoing basis, to make sure you're not left with bits and pieces there that don't mean anything to anyone over a period of time. Okay, so we're going to jump into the portal now. Let's have a quick look. Here we go. Okay, so when you first log into Azure DevOps, first of all, if you haven't created an organization, then it will ask you to create one, and it will ask you for a name. In this case, my email, it's just the first start of my email address, really, andrewshepherd82. So that's my organization. You can see I've got a new organization button here, so I can create more if I want to. And this is what I was saying about potentially locking that down to an Azure AD group. This is a development subscription, so it's not a big deal at all. But in a production environment or a corporate environment, you'll probably want to limit that to the possibility of creating new organizations to an Azure AD group, just to make sure you don't get too much sprawl there. So that's the organization level down the left hand side, and these are the projects within that particular organization that you can see in the middle here. And when I hover over each of those, you can see they're all enabled for Azure DevOps with all the different tools and functionality that we'll look at in a second. Just before we do that, I just want to very quickly touch on the organizational settings. So I mentioned that there are organizations and then projects within the organizations. It's a similar sort of thing for the settings, really. You can configure them at the organizational level, and then you can dig a little bit further and look at the particular project extensions as well. So if you want to invite guest users, you do that through the users panel. You have an add user section there. You can add them in. They can be users within your tenant, or they can be outside users as well, as long as you've got the functionality enabled to allow that to happen. You can add users. If it's an internal user, it will actually verify the username as you're going through. If it's an external user, you can use an email address and it will send them an email inviting them into the tenant. I briefly touched on billing. I will just look at this a little bit now just to show you what this looks like. So you can see for my organization, it's not, you get this button called Setup Billing. When you first look at this, you will see that. In my case, I've not configured that because, again, it's a development subscription, so I don't really need to. But if it's a corporate environment, you would want to configure that. And what that does is it attaches your Azure DevOps organization to a tenant within Azure. So the billing mechanisms for it all just happen under the same hood as your overall tenant. So if you've got a CSP or an enterprise agreement, that sort of thing, all the billing for DevOps would attach itself to your existing bill. Azure Active Directory, so I mentioned using the Azure AD group to restrict who can create organizations. Connecting to Azure AD is the way you would do that. You basically sign in with appropriate credentials and it will allow connectivity into Azure AD. You might want to create a service account for that rather than using a username or password for an existing user, just to make sure that everything, just to make sure that not everyone's got that level of access. You've got a couple of security policies that you can configure at the organizational level as well. It is worth having a look over those and just making sure that they're as you would expect for your organization. And permissions as well. I mentioned this is kind of the tenant root at the organizational level. So these permissions are project collection administrators and project collection build administrators, that kind of thing. And what that means is if you add a user into that group, that will then give them access to all of the projects within that organization. If you go into users here, when you actually add a user, you can specify specific projects if you want to, or all of them if you want to, and you can set the level of access that you want that particular user to have as well. You can have an unlimited amount of stakeholder users, and what that just gives read-only access to all the information. Basic users tends to be the standard, and you get 5 of those free with every deployment of Azure DevOps. And within those 5 users, you can usually use most of the functionality within Azure DevOps. So if you know that you're only going to have a handful of users that are actually going to use the product, then basic users up to 5 is perfect. You don't need to configure billing from that respect because you're never going to go over that particular number. But yeah, stakeholders, you can have as many of those as you want, and it's read access into the system. So people like project managers, for example, might want to make use of stakeholder access. Okay, so just going back to the sort of home page when you log in, as you can see, I've got a couple of projects here, Terraform and an MSDN testing one. Neither of these have anything production in, so they're just examples for me to be able to show you. So I'll just click on this one. And this is the sort of home screen that you're presented with when you first log in. So you get an overview. It is worth filling in about this project section, just so at a glance you can see what's going on here. It actually says C+ as languages there. That's not correct. It's actually PowerShell and Terraform, but you get the idea. You can edit that and fill that in and make sure that's relevant to the particular project that you're looking at. Dashboarding. So in this particular case, you can just add lots of different widgets to this screen, just to give you a bit of a high level view of what's going on within this particular project. So you can see, if I click on add, I've got lots of different options for charts and things, and you can move them around on there. And once you've finished editing, goes back to the main screen, looks like that. And in this particular case, I'm just showing all of the work items that are assigned to me. The wiki pages are, again, fairly self-explanatory. You can create a project wiki in here, so anything related to the particular project that you're working on. You can add knowledge base articles in here. When you go into the editor, you can add the content on here. and you see an example of what that's going to look like once it's published over the right hand side there. I'll just discard my changes there. Yeah, and obviously you can build that up with more and more information as more and more people are using the products and services that are in here. So I mentioned the three main functions of DevOps that people tend to use, which are boards, repos, and pipelines. So we're going to take each one of these in turn and just have a quick look at some of the items within here. So when you click on boards, you get basically a list of work items. So these are a combination of different types of features or changes or work items that you're going to be actually doing as part of a development that you've got at the moment. So in this case, I've got a couple of test ones you can see here, and I've got a task. What you can do is these are called user stories, and what that tends to be is a bunch of tasks or issues that particular user is working on. So that's assigned to me. You can see that there, and then within each user story you'd have a bunch of tasks. You perhaps have what's called an epic, which is a larger piece of work which might have a number of different tasks within it, and you might spread that over a couple of what's called sprints. I mentioned sprints earlier, where you sort of block things into like a 2-week period, and anything that comes into that particular sprint is only work that you can complete within that 2-week time block. So if I have a quick look at sprints there, you can see I've got a couple defined. Apologies, I don't. Yeah, so I've got 3 defined here. If I look at iteration 3, you can see it's got a couple of work items assigned to it, and it's got some dates up there. So that's happening between the 25th of October and 25th of September, sorry, and the 9th of October. And I would only accept work into that sprint that I know I can get done within that time. If anything else comes in, then it would push to the next sprint. If I knew I wouldn't be able to accommodate it within this one, if this one was full. And if there was an urgent change that was required, for example, then it would be a conversation with things like project managers or business sponsors for the particular product that you're talking about, where you would perhaps have to juggle some priorities around, move something out of your existing sprint and pull in the emergency item in so you can work on that a bit quicker. Boards is the other thing that is worth taking a look at. So this works on the basis of a Kanban board approach. So you may have seen this before. Products like Confluence, for example, use exactly the same approach. And you'll probably find that most DevOps type products and tool sets will work in the same way and give you the same type of boards to be able to use things. This is a fairly basic one. You've got your backlog of items in the new column here, anything you're actually working on here, and then anything that's resolved in this column here. And once it's resolved, after a period of time, it drops into the close column there. And everything will be listed in here with each user story. You can see it's a user story by the book icon there. Each user story could have a number of tasks in it. You can assign it to a number of people, and you can just move these around on the swim lanes as you see fit as you complete those items accordingly. Okay, just moving quickly on to repos then. So this is basically a Git repository. So if you think of a standard Git repository that you may have online, you can actually connect Azure DevOps to a third-party Git repository if you want. You don't necessarily have to use the Azure Git repository, which is quite nice, but it works in exactly the same way as any other type of Git repository. So if you want to edit a file, you just click on the edit button. You can make a change to the file, and then you can commit the change, and it will record that change as a updated item within the Git repository there. So you can see on the history tab, you can see all the changes that were made there, and you can compare those alongside each other as well. You can see in this case it's just white space, nothing important, but you can do that across all of the different files stored within here. And as I say, you can use third-party Git repositories as well. If you want to see a list of all the commits and changes to files, then commits is the tab you do that. Fairly self-explanatory. You can see here we've got some sort of parallel lines as they're running through here. These are called branches. So what happens is if you've got, for example, a couple of people working on a piece of code at the same time, they could each have their own individual branch, make a bunch of different changes, and then when they're ready, they can merge that into the main branch ready for deployment. And because each of those people may be working on different things, or you might want to sort of protect your main branch. Ideally, your main branch should be a fully working branch of code. So to push that would push out everything as you'd expect it to work. You would then branch out into a development branch, for example, to make your changes, and then when you're ready, you commit that back into your main branch and push that into your production environment. These pushes and pull requests. So you might have people who actually, when you create a branch, for example, you might want to go through an approval process before that's merged into the master branch, just to make sure that everything has been tested correctly or has been through test environments first before it's going to production, that type of thing. So when you create a push request, that would as a developer, you would push it into the main branch, and that would drop into someone's an approval queue, which would show as a pull request. You go into here, and you can then approve that accordingly. Looking at pipelines, so pipelines are your mechanism for actually pushing code from your Azure DevOps infrastructure into wherever you want to deploy code. So that could be Azure, that could be AWS, it could be GCP, it could be anywhere. And you'll see in a second there are a number of different options available to you out the box for doing that. So in this case, I've got a Terraform CI pipeline. It is a manual trigger pipeline, which basically means I need to click run pipeline to actually run it. You can create them to automatically trigger. So, for example, when code is automatically pushed to the main branch, then you can set the pipeline to automatically trigger. You wouldn't necessarily do that in a production environment. You might want to control when pipelines are ran. So you could potentially schedule that on a particular time every day. Or yeah, if it's a development environment, then sort of automatic triggering is probably the way forward. And you know that whenever you push changes in, they're going to be submitted and published to Azure or wherever you're deploying fairly quickly. You might have the concept of environments. I don't have that in here, but again, this is a development environment, but you might have a stage environment, for example, and then a production environment. And as part of that, you might have a gated release process where you wouldn't be allowed to publish to production until something's been published to a stage environment or a development or UAT environment, whatever that may be. Maybe more, maybe lots of a combination of multiple of those. Before it can go into production, and it would fail a production deployment if it hadn't been through those types of environments first. And that's just to prove that testing is successful and everything's been approved accordingly. Test plans. So you can create manual test plans in here, which you may want to like a step-by-step that you can follow for whenever you do a release for the particular project that you're working on. There are some automation options as well. So if you've got a website, for example, you can automate connecting to that website on port 443 to confirm it's up after a release has finished, that type of thing. And artifacts are used to be able to share your repository with third parties. So if you've got a completed product that's successfully deployed, you could drop it into an artifact here, and you'll be able to share that with other organizations who are also able to connect to your artifacts accordingly. Most people tend to use the boards, repos, and pipelines to get going, certainly. And once you're up to speed, then adding things like test plans and artifacts is good. But I think the boards and repos and pipelines bit tend to be the way forward to start with. So just very quickly touching on some of the project settings as well. So I mentioned that it was organizational level settings where you can set permissions and things like that. You've got the same sort of thing at the project level as well. So if you want to add users in at the organizational level, but don't necessarily want them to have access to every single project underneath, and this is where you would configure the permissions for that. So if you go into here, you've got a number of different project level permissions that you can look around there and set accordingly. Notifications, so every time a pipeline is pushed or a build is completed, you can receive an email or a text or whatever it is that you may want. GitHub connection, so I mentioned third-party Git repository. This is where you would connect up there, so you obviously just credentials to connect into that from there, and off you go. Parallel jobs, I did want to talk about this a little bit in that you can see here I'm using the free tier, which gives me one parallel job of up to 1,800 minutes per month. And what that means is one user can run a pipeline at any given time. If somebody else wants to run a pipeline at the same time, then that will queue behind the already running pipeline, if that makes sense. And I've got 1,800 minutes a month to play with for that. So if I've got 5 users using the free tier, it's unlikely that those 5 users are all going to be pushing pipelines at the exact same time. So that single parallel job is probably fine. And it's also unlikely that we're going to hit the 1,800 minutes a month as well. So that's probably fine. But if we do have large teams who are working in Azure DevOps at any given time, then there is a likelihood we are going to need to configure billing to allow them to purchase more parallel jobs, so more than one person can run a pipeline at the same time, and B, to give more users than the sort of basic 5 users access to Azure DevOps. The next thing I just wanted to touch on real quick was service connection. So if you want to actually deploy into an environment from Azure DevOps, then a service connection is the first port of call to allow you to do that, really. Before you can run a pipeline, you need to set up a service connection to be able to do that, and then you configure the pipeline to use the service connection, which then hooks into the environment that you want to deploy to. So you can see here I've got a list of stuff down the left-hand side. AWS I mentioned earlier, we've got Azure Resource Manager there, which tends to be the one that people use most of, but GCP is there as well, all the sort of expected ones you'd see in that list. You basically select the destination that you want to deploy to, click on Next, and it gives you some options of the types of identity that you can use to actually push resources out to that environment. So in this case, I would use an automatic service principal, and what that would do is it would actually create an Azure AD object that you can then assign permissions to in Azure to be able to deploy to. And you can deploy that at a number of different levels. So in this case, I've got a subscription and I've got a management group or machine learning workspace. You can select any of those as you're going through to determine where you want to deploy things. All you have to do is have rights to be able to authenticate with Azure at that time when you sign in. So if, for example, if you've configured a landing zone with management groups, then you need to have RBAC control at the management group level that you want to allow Azure DevOps to deploy to. So it's probably the root management group or maybe just one below. So you need to have quite high level permissions to be able to assign that permission. Once you've done that, you're effectively assigning the service principal in Azure those permissions rather than having to have individual users with those permissions. So you can probably revoke some of the specific user permissions and just leave them in place for Azure DevOps, which is quite a nice way of doing it. And obviously within Azure DevOps, you get all the auditing and stuff like that. So whenever somebody makes a change or pushes a pipeline, it's all recorded in Azure DevOps for you. Okay, so I think that's probably enough of the portal there. I'll just jump back to the slides very quickly. So yeah, I just wanted to touch a little bit more on billing. So I mentioned that using the free tier, you do get 5 basic users, which entitles you to use the boards, repos, and pipelines. If you want to use things like test plans, then you need to start using paid for user accounts. So you see you get 5 basic users for free there, which does entitle you to use most of the bits that people use. But if you do want to expand out into test plans and artifacts, that type of thing, then you do need to start looking at perhaps paid user accounts. And when you set up the billing, as I say, it hooks up to your existing Azure billing and comes through under the same banner as that. And just some examples of cost there. These were accurate at time of creating the slides, but they might be slightly different now, but you get the idea. As I say, basic users, £4.48 per month. If you want to start using test plans, then obviously the user cost goes up a little bit there. If you're using artifacts, you do get 2 gigabits of free space, but it's a per gigabit cost after that. So if you've got more and more resources being stored in there, then you would have to pay a little bit more for that. And those parallel jobs, so if you wanted to use more than one person running a pipeline at any given time, then you've got an almost £30 cost for a Microsoft hosted parallel job. The difference between Microsoft hosted and self-hosted is you could effectively build a virtual machine and install some services on it to make it act like a deployment agent for you to be able to push services into wherever you want to deploy. And if you're doing that, then it's a much cheaper cost because you're not paying for the Microsoft compute to be able to run that pipeline in the background. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Any questions, please let one of the guys at Visual know. I'm sure we can talk to you about these things in a little bit more detail as needed. But thank you very much. Cheers.